Hello, my name is Jared. Welcome to my channel, Keen Reads. And today I'm going to be talking to you about an author who's slowly becoming one of my favorite authors. An author that a lot of you have probably heard about, and you obviously know who I'm going to talk about from the title of this video. But a writer that I was surprised to find has a whole mass of works that are worth diving into beyond some of his more famous works. And that is Roberto Bolaño. So Roberto Bolaño was a Chilean author. He was born in 1953 in Chile. Spent some time going back and forth between Chile and Mexico. So he originally moved to Mexico when I think he was about like 15 or 16 or something like that. Dropped out of school and then went back to Chile in a couple years to join the revolution. When he was in Mexico, he dropped out of school, became a journalist, got involved in some political activities, and then went back to Chile to participate in the revolution that was going on at that time. Although there is some ambiguity about whether this actually happened and the extent to how involved that he was. Not going to get into that because I don't know anything about it. Most of this recap I've got is from this book or from just Wikipedia. So you can read his Wikipedia page if you want. I'm just summarizing it for you. Eventually went back to Mexico, and then in 1977, I believe, so he would have been about 25 or so, he moved to Europe, ended up settling down in Spain, I believe, with his family, and worked a lot of odd jobs. This whole time he was writing poetry, and then it wasn't until he was about 40 or so that he switched from poetry to prose, which is the majority of his work that's been published. And his reason for switching from poetry to prose was really to earn an income for his family. He wasn't making money in poetry and wanted to be able to support his family. He was also suffering from liver failure at the time and eventually passed away in 2003 while awaiting a liver transplant. So I figured once we get through this biography, I'm going to talk about some themes in his works and why I like them. And then we'll walk through the works of his that I have read. And I'm going to give you some reading order, some tips, some summary, just random stuff. Whatever pops into my head. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is this book. So this is by Chris Andrews, who translated these three books that I most recently read. So what got me into Bolaño? I guess we'll start there. So I had heard a lot of stuff about 2666, and I eventually ended up picking it up, reading it, and I loved it. I'll talk a little bit more about the specific books at the end of this video. And then I was at Barnes & Noble, and I found this really beautiful edition of By Night in Chile. I wasn't actually interested in it as that much, but I just thought that this copy was very beautiful, and I just fell in love with it, and I ended up picking this up. Loved this, read it in one sitting. From there, I went to The Savage Detectives. And then after that, I wasn't really interested in reading any more Bolaño. I thought that was kind of it. His big two books were 2666, The Savage Detectives. And then I thought if I was going to read anything beyond that, it'd be By Night in Chile, which I had done. So I kind of checked him off my list. That took me to maybe a couple months ago when I went to Barnes & Noble. Again, I don't go to Barnes & Noble very often. Most of my shopping is done at used bookstores or on eBay. But I was at Barnes & Noble. I think my wife was looking for something, or maybe I was there while she was shopping at a nearby store. And I saw that there was a lot of Bolaño books there. And I was kind of surprised because I hadn't heard much about Bolaño beyond those two major works that we already talked about. But there was a whole slew of his minor works there, which is not something I usually see at Barnes & Noble. So I ended up talking about it with some friends in a Discord, a Discord that I'm in from the channel Orpheus, who's a great channel. You should check him out. And they were like, yeah, Bolaño is great. There's so much more about him. And Picador, who published these 3 volumes, along with many others, are actually in the process of republishing most of his works in translation from Chris Andrews, who, again, wrote this book, which I picked up, which is a book of literary criticism about his works. So that's kind of my journey with Roberto Bolaño. he's kind of a perfect author for me in that he talks about the things that I love to read about. And that is poets, poetry, writing, publishing, the whole literary scene. All of his novels or all of his works that I've read so far have to do with that kind of feeling or that kind of ethos. I don't know if ethos is the right word. Probably not. Pathos, logos. I'm just covering all the bases here. But they really all have to do with that feeling of being involved in a literary community, which is something that I've never had a part of, being more of a STEM person. So it really is something that I've always wanted to have my toe dipped into, but I've never been able to. And I feel like he offers me that opportunity. What else is there? Regarding his writing itself, there's not a lot of specific quotes or things that I really pull out that I'm like, I want to go back to later, which I've showed you in a lot of the other books that I read. I mark with a lot of sticky notes, highlights, or really standout quotes or things like that that I want to come back to, or that if I'm just walking by my bookshelf and I pull off a book, I can read the best quotes and things. You'll notice that I have maybe 1 to 2, you probably can't tell, but maybe 1 to 2 sticky notes for each of these books. And it seems to be like that for most of my favorite authors. So similar to Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Alice Munro, who are 2 of my favorite authors. I'm actually planning a video on Munro next, so stay tuned. But if you look at their books on my shelves, there's much less sticky notes than with other authors that I have that I don't like as much. And I think that's because it feels like every sentence they write was written specifically with me in mind. It feels like they're writing to me. And that if I was to mark everything that I loved, I would mark the whole book. So really, I find that the books that I love the most, by authors that I love the most, I don't really tag a lot because I really want to go back and reread the whole work. And I find that Bolaño falls into that kind of area for me. I actually have some notes for this video, which is surprising. I've never taken notes, or I very rarely take notes for videos. But regarding what he writes about, I think I already kind of talked about the gist of it. Something that stands out to me about his writing is that, again, he's constantly talking about poets and poetry. But there's very little poets and poetry, or there's very little poetry in his actual writing. I first want to share this quote from, again, this book by Chris Andrews, where he talks about Bolaño's ideas about poets. So, in The Best Gang, so The Best Gang being the name of a short story, Bolaño writes, and from here it's a quote, "If I had to hold up the most heavily guarded bank in Europe and I could choose my partners in crime, I'd take a gang of 5 poets, no question about it. 5 real poets. Apollonian or Dionysian, but always real, ready to live and die like poets. No one in the world is as brave as a poet. No one in the world faces disaster with more dignity and understanding." And Bolaño considered himself a poet first and foremost. Like I said, he spent most of his life writing poetry and then switched to prose really just to be pragmatic. And there's actually a quote in Savage Detectives that says as much, basically. That basically says, someone has gone to prose because they want to make money or they have some ulterior motives, whereas poets write poetry because they must write poetry. But like I said earlier, there's a lot of it's actually in apologies, this is going to be a really rambly video, but this is actually a quote from Ben Lerner's Introduction to Distant Star. But he says, "And it is a story," speaking of this book, "like so many of Bolaño's stories in which poetry is everywhere and poems are nowhere to be found." So there's very little poetry in any of these books. There's some poems in The Savage Detectives, and I think maybe some in 2666, but in the other ones I've read, there's really not much poetry, even though poetry is the main topic of the video, or of the book. And I've actually never read any, for someone who considers himself a poet first and foremost, I've actually never read any poetry by Bolaño. I know Picador published, I think actually this month or last month, his collected poetry. So I plan on picking that up soon. But that's kind of I feel like his thought process around poetry and prose and things along those lines. It also feels like the way that he talks about poetic movements. So Bolaño and his friends started a movement in Mexico when he returned back to Mexico after going to Chile for the revolution. That he started a movement called the Infrareal movement, I believe. So him and of himself started a poetic movement. But I feel like the way that he talks about poetic movements feels like he's talking about empires rising and falling, with the key leaders of these poetic movements leading their movements against other movements, almost like empires battling with their emperors versus conquerors. I don't know. It feels like he takes poetics to an epic level. The importance with which he gives it. And specifically, I feel that way about like the Savage Detectives, as well as Amulet also talks about this and speaks about poetry and poetic movements in this way. As far as the recurring themes, he talks a lot about evil, and specifically Nazism and fascism are a main topic of a lot of his books, or several of his books, and not just evil in these agencies such as Nazism or fascism, but sociopaths. There's a whole chapter on how Bolaño approaches evil in this book. Another one of his kind of hallmarks is recurring characters, and he actually has a stand-in character that appears in a lot of his books named Arturo Bolaño, who is a stand-in for the author Roberto Bolaño. But I did want to read this quote from, again, this book by Chris Andrews that talks about how his characters circulate through his books. And I'm going to be skipping around in this, so it's not just one direct quote. So, broadly speaking, there are three ways characters circulate in Bolaño's fiction: return, renaming, and transfiguration. Sometimes characters simply return with the same name and the same properties, or new properties that are compatible with those manifested in earlier appearance. So that's probably like, I guess when I would think about Arturo Bolaño, really his alter ego seems to play a similar role whenever he shows up in these novels. Sometimes characters are renamed. They come back with a new name, but with unchanged or compatible properties. So that is similar to the character Carlos Weeder, who is the main character, or I guess the main antagonist of Distant Star, and also is in the last chapter of Nazi Literature in the Americas, but has a completely different name. But they're talking about the same character. And then the last thing is sometimes characters are transfigured. Their properties change to the point of incompatibility, while their name remains the same and is recognizably similar. And this would be, an example would be Archimboldi, who plays a different role in The Savage Detectives and a much minor role than he does in 2666. So recurring characters is something that you'll find throughout his works, and it's something that I kept in mind when I'm trying to come up with a reading order for you all, at least from what I've read. Again, I'm no expert on Bolaño. I'm no expert on anything, but I'm just trying to offer some experience and hopefully offer a way for you to get into this awesome author. I think that's all I wanted to talk about regarding the works themselves and Bolaño, his biography, before we get into the individual works. So regarding the individual works, I'm going to start by talking about Nazi literature in the Americas. I'm going to talk about By Night in Chile first, because this is his first work, I believe, that was translated into English. So this was written in 2000 and translated into English in 2003. Again, I think it's interesting to keep in mind when he wrote all of these, because you'll find that all of these were written within like a 7-year span or something like that. So By Night in Chile follows a priest, and it takes place in a single evening and is very rambling and widespread, and there's just a lot going on. It goes in a lot of different directions. It's kind of the description that I found online calls it a feverish monologue of a flawed man and a failing priest. It takes place in a single evening, and I read this in a single evening. I did not plan to, but it's actually one giant paragraph, so similar to Austerlitz, which I talked about in a previous video. It kind of lends itself to a very quick read and reading through it in one sitting. And I actually read this, again, in one sitting, and I gave this 5 stars. It was the third Bolaño that I had read after 2666 and The Savage Detectives. Next, we will talk about Nazi literature in the Americas. So Nazi literature in the Americas was written in 1996, but it wasn't translated until 2008. Again, this translation is by Chris Andrews. So was this edition of By Night in Chile, was also translated by Chris Andrews. But Nazi literature in the Americas feels like something straight out of a Jorge Luis Borges short story, in that it is a collection, almost like an encyclopedia, with each encyclopedia entry detailing the life of some type of Nazi sympathizer or someone who is even tangentially associated with Nazism, fascism. And there's just so many imaginary characters, authors, and works that it's just a really rich experience. And like I said, it really reads almost like something you would read in Borges. From here, we'll talk. So this was Nazi literature in the Americas. Obviously, from the title, all of the encyclopedia entries take place or are representing authors who are from the Americas, both North and South America. After this, I want to talk about Distant Star. So Distant Star takes the last chapter or the last entry from Nazi literatures in America and creates an entire novella about it. This was written in 1996 as well, translated in 2004. And this really follows a sociopath named Carlos Wider throughout his life, and I believe it's told from the point of view of Arturo Bolaño, actually, or Bolaño, who was recounting his interactions with this Carlos Wider, who changes his name several times as well throughout his life. Again, changing names. His name is changed from Distant Star to Nazi literatures as well. I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 stars. I gave Nazi literature as well 4 stars. Yeah. After this, we will talk about The Savage Detectives. So The Savage Detectives is probably his second most well-known, I would say, novel or book behind 2666. It was published in 1998 and translated in 2007. And this follows 2 poets, Ulysses, I think that's how you say his name. I'm probably butchering it. Lima and Arturo Bolaño, as they are looking out for Cesarea Tinjero, I think that's her name. She is the founder of the visceral realist movements, I believe. I might be crossing some wires here, but essentially they are some up-and-coming poets who are in the hunt for the founder of this poetic movement. And it follows their adventures across Mexico City, the Sonora Desert, as they are searching for this woman. Next, we'll talk about Amulet. So Amulet was written in 1999 and published in English in 2006. And this tells the story of someone who calls herself the mother of Mexican poetry. She actually has a chapter in The Savage Detectives that talks about her. So she was a character who, during a rebellion or some type of military takeover in, I believe, 1968 at a university in Mexico City, she hid out in a bathroom for 12 days. And this book is the goings-ons of her mind during this period, talking about the past. She somehow is thinking about the future and talking about future events while she's perseverating in this bathroom for 12 days with nothing to eat, writing poetry on toilet paper. A really powerful book. Again, I gave this 4 stars. I gave Savage Detectives 5 stars. It was a phenomenal book. So that is Amulet. And then we'll talk about 2666. So also, Amulet is the only book, I believe, of Bolaño's that actually mentions the year 2666. I believe the closest that 2666 gets to mentioning 2666 is they say something occurs in the year 2600 or so 26 something something. But they actually mention the year 2666 in Amulet. Anyways, going to 2666. So this was published posthumously in 2004 in Spanish, and then published in English in 2008. There's 5 parts to it. It's a massive book. It's probably his magnum opus. I gave this 5 stars, and it's hard to say what it's about because it's about so many different things. It starts out talking about some critics who are obsessed with a writer named Archimboldi, and they travel to Mexico to try to find him. There's a very hard to read section called the part about the crimes, where it just talks about the disappearance and murder of... Sorry, I think my dogs are trying to get into the room. The murder and disappearance of women in a city called Santa Teresa, I believe. But it's a stand-in for Ciudad Juarez, which is just across the Texas border in Mexico City. Kind of a hotbed of crime and murder. And he's just talking about these, in a very matter-of-fact way, these murders that keep taking place, specifically the murders of women. At one point, it goes to the Eastern Front in World War II. Like I said, just a sprawling novel talking about a lot of different things. And that's what I've read of Bolaño. As far as like a reading order, I would say you could probably start anywhere you want. If you want to dive right in, you can dive right in with 2666 or The Savage Detectives. If you want something a little shorter to just dip your toes in, I would definitely recommend By Night in Chile. But as far as reading in order or things like that, I would probably read... If you were going to read Amulet, I would read The Savage Detectives first, because this is kind of the expansion of a chapter of The Savage Detectives. And I would also read Distant Star after Nazi Literature in the Americas, because, again, like I said, Distant Star is the expansion of a chapter of Nazi Literature in the Americas. And then, if you just can't get enough, this is also an excellent book going over some criticism. I definitely plan on reading some more Bolaño. Last Evenings on Earth is something that I'm looking forward to, which is a short story collection, as well as his poetry collection, are probably the next 2 that I'll pick up sometime. That was a lot of jabbering, a lot of yapping, but I hope you enjoyed this video. I would highly encourage you to look into Roberto Bolaño, maybe pick up some of his lesser-known works. And if you have any other recommendations for who might be the best Latin American poet or Latin American author since Marquez, who's one of my favorite authors, let me know where else I should read. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.